Mr. Griffin is going to talk about Syria, and he's going to talk about why it matters to us. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you Mr. Nick Griffin, MEP. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Syria has been in the news, as you know, to a huge extent. It's now slightly less in the news, not least because the focus of the news has moved on to the latest wave of the crazy Wahhabi Islamist assault on civilization, which was against secular Syria. Now we've seen it in Nairobi. So the news moves on, but nevertheless, Syria and what happened and what didn't happen, because there hasn't been a war, is something very, very important in the history of this year, in fact, in the history of our times. Why does it matter to us? Well, it matters because war is bad. And an unjust war, a war, if anything, on the wrong side, is even worse. Britain has been involved, as you know, in far too many wars that have nothing to do with us. Iraq was a total disaster. We took a stable, secular, socialist dictatorship, which was no harm to anybody in the rest of the world, and Blair and Bush turned it into a howling wilderness of appalling sectarianism and an incubator for Islamist terrorism, which is now striking all over the world. Afghanistan, 8 years we've been there. Billions and billions and billions of pounds which should have been spent on the health service, on education, on re-equipping British industry, thrown down the drain. So now we're talking to the Taliban, and when we leave next year, that country will be handed back to those people. A total disaster which the British people never wanted. So wars like that, they are innately bad, and as you know, this party has always stood against those wars. There's other reasons. There's political reasons for doing so. You can't, in the end, establish nationalism in one country. The nationalist government we want, the nationalist state we want, a state which says that the purpose of the government is to put its own people first. Therefore, the state must control the biggest of big business. The state must have restrictions on how much big business can do. The state should provide a health service instead of privatising it. The state should provide and make money from a post office instead of privatising it. Our nationalist message is so out of kilter with what the globalist elite wants that if nationalism is established in one country, they will destroy it. It's really as simple as that. We're involved in a global struggle, so what happens in a country a long way away affects all of us, and what happens in a nationalist country, which is what Syria is, affects every other nationalist on the planet, because we have a global enemy and it's a global struggle. Now, the European Union, everybody knows out there, I think, that the European Union was begun from the very beginning as something which aims to, intended to, and is doing. The purpose was to destroy the nation state, to destroy the institutions of the nation state, to destroy the political sovereignty, the economic sovereignty of one nation state after another. That's what the EU is all about. Pretty much everybody gets that. What is less well known is that from the same people who created that, particularly a man called Coudenhove-Kalergi, who was really the father of the idea of the European Union, he had a dual track. He wanted, in order to establish a United States of Europe as a step to one world government, he wanted, and he said openly, its purpose is to destroy the nation states and their institutions. But his second track was also to destroy the peoples of the nation states. He made no bones about it. That was the purpose. He also made no bones about the fact that they needed a united Europe, even in those days, to counter Russia. And that mentality hasn't just destroyed the institutions of Britain, hasn't just destroyed our 1,000 years of democracy, isn't just undermining our jury system, hasn't just destroyed our fishing fleet. It's also that same mentality to destroy the peoples of the West, is what lies behind mass immigration, multiculturalism, enforced diversity where everybody counts except us, the British, the indigenous, particularly except the English. This hadn't happened by accident. It's a deliberate plan by the globalist elite to destroy the peoples of Europe, including us, but not just including us. They also now, you look at Western Europe, it's almost finished in demographic terms. The work of those who set about destroying the nation-states of Europe and the peoples of Europe is largely done. I was born in London. I'm English. I'm a minority in my own capital city of my own homeland. And I speak to French nationalists and they say I was born in Paris and now French people are a minority in Paris. Or I spend, as you know, a lot of time in Brussels, the capital of Belgium. It used to be a Flemish city. Now the Flemish come in to work in the day and they leave at night. Brussels is no longer a Flemish, it's no longer even a Belgian city. Berlin is, I think it's the third largest Turkish city in the world. Wherever you look in Western Europe, the indigenous peoples are becoming, in our key areas, minorities, and the path of the future is all too clear to see. And the people who did this want to do the same to Eastern Europe. There were times repeatedly, especially in the 19th century, when the force of Russia changed the politics of Western Europe. Time and time again, Russia saved Prussia 3 times, as a matter of fact, from French domination. There will come a time when the only future for European people and European civilization, if we can't turn things around democratically through the ballot box, as we strive so hard to do, within the next 10 or 15 years, the only future for the peoples of the West will be Russia. It's the last bastion of the white race. It's politically very incorrect to say so, but that is a simple fact. I repeat it, Russia is the last bastion of the white race, and if Russia falls, it's pretty much all over. Now, Russia recently is taking her responsibilities very seriously. You look at Russia today, which, with respect to our ITV crew here, is the only television station in the whole of the world using the English language, which actually tells the truth. That's because Russia is taking her responsibilities seriously. It's a tremendously important sign. But the people, where this connects to Syria, is that the people who've destroyed so much of Western Europe want to do the same to Russia, because their taking over of the world for global capitalism isn't finished until they've got Russia back into the hands of the looters, because Putin has taken Russia out of the hands of the looters, and they want Russia. To get Russia, it's a domino effect. They started with Syria. Sorry, they started with Libya. Libya went down, bang. If they could have taken out Syria, then the next target would be much easier, Iran. They want to take out Iran because that then opens the path to the Caucasus and the soft southern underbelly of Russia, because they want Russia. It's Russia is actually the target. White Mother Russia is the target of the attack on Syria. It's simply a domino effect by the global elite, by the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia, by the Zionists. This collective organisation of monsters who've brought war and destruction and horror to everything they've touched in this world. Russia was their target, but they had to take Syria. So they came up with a ridiculous lie that the Syrians had used chemical weapons on their own people in the very same week that a United Nations chemical inspections team entered Syria at the request of the Syrian government. Utter nonsense, the idea that that was them. And since then, we've had the facts, the clear facts, that the rebels have been filmed with chemical weapons. They've been caught in Turkey and Iraq with chemical weapons. They've boasted about using the chemical weapons. So it was to be a war on totally false pretences. I wanted to take you back now to the end of August, just a few weeks ago, when at one stage it looked as though Britain was literally hours, or rather the Cameron government was literally hours from striking against Syria, with, they said, a limited strike of 200 cruise missiles, each one costing £1 million, plus the backup. That's £250,000 down the drain in 12 hours. And that's what they were saying. And at one point, Cameron was saying, on the news, they were saying, the planes are being fuelled up. The missiles have been moved. Everything is in position. It's about to happen. And at the very last minute, Cameron slightly lost his bottle. And he decided, I think, as he understood how much the British public didn't want this war. And the British public didn't want that war because the British public aren't stupid. When Cameron was saying it's a limited strike, the British public knew there's no such thing when you get into a mess like that as a limited strike. The limited strike starts it. A limited strike obviously would have led to Syrian retaliation. Very, very clearly then America would have got involved, as she was itching to do. Israel would have got involved. Iran would have got involved. It would have become, at the very least, a regional war, potentially a world war, but certainly a regional war. Everybody knew it. Cameron was saying, as Obama said later, oh, don't worry, our troops won't be involved on the ground. What nonsense is this? They were talking openly about regime change, i.e. destroying the Syrian government, while saying at the same time the Syrian government had chemical weapons, which it clearly did, because chemical weapons are known across the world as the poor man's nuclear bomb. And in response to Israel's enormous illegal creation of a 200 warhead nuclear arsenal, people around Israel created the poor man's nuclear bomb, the Syrian response, as a deterrent. Didn't mean they ever intended to use those weapons any more than any British government. I'm sure even the most evil, like Blair or Brown or Cameron, actually want to use Britain's nuclear weapons. I'm sure they don't. They're there as a deterrent to stop someone else throwing something horrible at us because they can't afford the cost. And that's why Syria had those chemical weapons. But if they'd had their way, and a war which tipped the balance, as they openly said that's what they want, a war which would tip the balance so the Syrian government lose it and the rebels win, then every single one of those chemical weapons arms dumps would have fallen into the hands of the rebels. And I've met, as I'm sure you know, I've met captive rebels, and those rebels are not secular, moderate, liberal nationalists like us. They're Islamist fanatics who say quite openly, when we destroyed democratic secular Syria, when we've purged and killed all the Christians, all the Jews, all the Shia, all the moderate Sunni, then we're coming to attack Europe and the United States. They're quite open about it. The difference would have been, if that war had gone ahead, that in some months' time, instead of an attack in Westgate in Kenya involving machine guns and hand grenades, it would have involved sarin nerve gas, because that's what they would have got if David Cameron had handed them control of that poor country. We were hours away from that. And at the point when we were literally hours away from it, I contacted several people in Syria who I met when I was there in June. And I said, I'm willing to come to help you fight back against this in PR terms. Do you want me to come? And I got, yes, please come. So myself, Clive Jefferson and Charlie Wythe from our publicity department, we were already virtually in Brussels, where we were going for an informal meeting with other nationalists for 3 days to discuss really in-depth public relations publicity ideas. Next minute we know, we're on a flight to Beirut. And once you get into Beirut, you then have to, well, we actually had to take, it's a little bit scary, just to take a taxi when the man in the hotel is literally begging you not to go to the border. In the end, he said, well, if you must go to the border, please go from a different hotel. Don't go from my hotel, please. I'm begging you. So we went to the border. Of course, we didn't tell him why we wanted to go to the border, because you never know whose side someone is on in Lebanon, because it's had a civil war through external interference in the past. And had the Syrian attack gone ahead, Lebanon would have slipped into civil war as well. So we just had to say we wanted to go to the border just to look. Of course, we didn't. We wanted to go to the border to cross the border, which we did. And we were duly from the other side taken in a government-provided car through the fast lane of all the checkpoints, and we were taken into the centre of Syria, put in a hotel, and there we were. An idea of how much strain that involves. Clive Jefferson used to smoke. For years he hadn't smoked. When one of the taxi drivers offered him a cigarette on the border, he snatched it. And despite my best entreaties to him to think, he said, look, we're going to die anyway, I may as well smoke. Seriously, when you get to a city, and when I was there in June, although the BBC didn't show the film, they interviewed me in a bombed police station where 2 suicide bombers had just killed themselves and a dozen poor young policemen. You get to that place and there's the crump of artillery fire in the background and the strong possibility of British cruise missiles raining down on military targets and the central television station, which is 100 yards from your hotel. It is, in fact, slightly scary. There we go. Cameron, nevertheless, by this stage, all of a sudden, basically once we were travelling there, said, no, we're going to have a vote. So, think back. It appeared certain that he was going to win that vote. That appeared a done deal. It was going to go through. Everyone thought that was the case. And he didn't. 13 votes, which is actually 7 people changing their minds. Just 7 MPs, Tory MPs, who should have voted with the government, changed their minds and voted for no attack. They voted for peace. Why? Well, according to an inside source between the Syrians and the BBC, I don't know about ITV, but they spoke to quite a number of British MPs who'd received a letter. They received a letter from the Speaker of the Syrian Parliament. Many of you will have seen it on our website. It was a letter addressed to John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons, from the Speaker of the Syrian People's National Assembly, the Syrian Parliament, headed an open letter to our fellow parliamentarians of the British House of Commons. It's a 4-page letter which was carefully crafted, not just to appeal at the obvious level, but also to do one particularly important thing, to remove a bit of the demonisation. Because when the warmongering mass media, particularly the BBC, just talk about the Syrian regime, the Assad regime and so on, they're totally dehumanising it, that you can start dropping bombs on these people without killing young conscripts. You can drop bombs on their television station and you're taking out the government propaganda network. No, you're killing journalists. Some possibly deserve it in some parts of the world. You're also killing the janitor and the cleaner. In any case, even those journalists, seriously, they've got wives and husbands and kids. And to be taken out by a cruise missile because our government is in the pocket of the Saudi Arabians and the Zionist lobby, what an outrageous thing to happen to anybody. So the letter was aimed with phrases like, more important still, we write to you as fathers and mothers, as members of families and communities, really not so different to yours. We write to you as fellow human beings, for if you bomb us, shall we not bleed? That phrase told a number of journalists, that's written by someone who understands Shakespeare. Very unusual for the Syrians. And the letter talked about how British parliamentarians had previously been led astray by dodgy dossiers on weapons of mass destruction. Things like that were designed to really bring it home to the MPs receiving it, really what they were about to vote to do. They were about to vote on the grounds of intelligence no stronger, in fact weaker, than the fraudulent intelligence on Iraq. They were about to vote to kill people who were parliamentarians just like them, who were fathers and mothers just like them. So the letter was aimed at these things, and it had specifically several offers. Before this, the Arab way when you're in a confrontation tends to be, you have a go at us and we'll rip your head off. That kind of defiance. There's no point trying to defy a state which is far stronger than you when you're trying to persuade the legislators of that state that actually there's a peaceful route. If you they're entitled to wave the sabre of war, considering Cameron's there rattling a huge sabre marked cruise missiles, 200 of the damn things, but it wouldn't have helped. And this letter was different. It said, we invite you as fellow parliamentarians to come to our country, either en masse or by sending a delegation, at the earliest time convenient to you. So it's saying, you don't have to bomb us, you know. Why don't you come and look and talk about it? For starters, it said, we suggest it might be particularly appropriate for such a visit to coincide with the conclusion of the current United Nations investigation into the chemical attack, which we condemn without reservation. So they hadn't said that before. They said it wasn't us. They hadn't said, we condemn this without reservation. Not in English. They said it in their own language, but not in the English language. And they finally said, we invite you to bring your own experts with you to check for yourselves the UN's conclusions. So for anyone with a doubt, there we are, it's given them the chance. Let's give these people the benefit of the doubt. It's a good way of assuaging my doubt. So that was the letter. As I say, according to the BBC, it had a very significant effect on a number of MPs. Because of that, the vote went from being almost a dead cert for war, for our involvement in a war, for our troops to get dragged into a war, because if those cruise missiles and the resulting chaos had tipped the balance against the Syrian government, at the point at which the rebels were about to get huge quantities of munitions, including chemical weapons, they would have had to send British and American troops into Syria on the ground to seize those weapons. So the argument that a clinical, surgical attack from a long way away could stop there, utter nonsense. Had that war started, British troops would probably already now be fighting and dying in Syria, fighting not just the government forces, but fighting the very people that we were theoretically helping, the Free Syrian Army and their monstrous monstrous gang of Islamist cutthroat, liver-eating, heart-eating rebels. That's where we were. But because Cameron was stopped by 7 votes, Obama then lost his nerve and he had to go to Congress. And he'd have lost that vote in Congress too, not least because a very similar letter, but targeted at the mindset of congressmen, also went to them. See, this letter, the one I'm talking about, was targeted absolutely at British MPs. It was written by someone who understands how those people think. It was written by someone who went to university, went to school and then university with those kind of people, who sits with those kind of people. That's why it worked. And the same would have been done with some changes with the American one. So Obama would probably have lost that vote anyway. So, because Obama, in the end, the vote, the possible vote in America bought time. And in that time, Putin and Russia stepped in and did the right thing and said, let's stick by international law. And they came in with an offer which the Americans really couldn't refuse. So as you now know, there's a serious chance of peace. And there's also a very, very serious chance, in fact, it's going to happen, that Syria's weapons of mass destruction will be destroyed, which is a good thing. It'll be an even better thing if that leads on to pressure, for instance, to Israel, to destroy her vast arsenal of chemical weapons, which are a threat to everybody else in the area as well. So it's something that's made a real difference. That letter stopped the war, and far worse than that. So it stopped £250 million in British taxpayers' money being blown in the first 12 hours. That would have been the cost of the first strike. In 1 week, Cameron and his fellow war criminals would have blown £500 million. Do you know that's exactly how much they will screw out of poor working people in this country with a bedroom tax? All the misery they're imposing right now on thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people to save £500 million, and they'd have blown it like that, killing poor bloody little Syrian conscripts, lads of 18 and 19, and civilians living near them. That's how wicked that would have been. They would have created, it would already be on its way, an Islamist terror state on the very borders of Europe, as I say, with chemical weapons, which we'd have had to send our troops in to get out. The chaos would have pushed oil to $400 a barrel overnight, which would snuff out any possible economic recovery in the Western Europe, in the Western world, and have plunged us all into a 10-year depression. That's how serious it would have been. And Iran would have got involved. Iran possibly would have fallen. Then they're at the gates of the Caucasus, they're at the gates of Russia, and the globalists get their way. That's how important that vote was, how important that letter was. What I can tell you now is that letter that made the difference, not least primarily because it bought time for President Putin to bring some common sense to the International Debating Chamber, that letter, which changed history, I wrote. Don't get me wrong, that letter that stopped the war in its tracks, yes, I wrote it, but everything in it came from the Syrians. The initial idea came from them. They asked for help. The offers in it were all discussed with them and approved by them. Every word was gone through with a Syrian who spoke very, very good English, but still couldn't have written it because he couldn't put himself in the head of a British MP in the way that I can put myself in the head of a British MP. Tell you what, some things you see in that head aren't nice, but still, you can put yourself in the head. I can because, as I say, I've grown up with them and I sit with their kind in the European Parliament because I was made an MEP by the efforts of people like you and by the voters of Blackpool and further abroad in the northwest of England. So the Syrians approved that letter. They came up with the offers. They were happy with the contents and we worked on it together. We worked to the really tightest deadline. We were sitting up late at night speaking with one of the key people in the Syrian government as to what we should put in, how we should pitch it, and so on. And then I sat up all night and I wrote that by myself because I can't write. You can't write anything worthwhile in a damn committee. In fact, you rarely do anything worthwhile in a committee, as I'm sure most of you know. So I sat up all night and I wrote it. And it's pretty hot over there in late August, so I actually wrote it on the balcony of the hotel, with occasionally crumps of artillery fire in the distance, and one burst of machine gun fire quite close. And then an hour before dawn, the huge mosque just around the corner from the hotel sets off the call to prayer. So just as I was going to bed, it was a most surreal experience, having finished this letter and having sat through the crumps of artillery fire as I wrote it. There's this call to prayer, which rather stopped me going to sleep for a little while, but in the end I got to sleep. And the next morning I sat with Clive Jefferson, Charlie Wythe, and a key and very, very well-informed Syrian, and we polished it and we tweaked it, and we worked for hours, but to a really tight deadline. I've never worked to a deadline like it with so much at stake. And it went out just in time for the MPs to get it, for John Bercow to write and say yes, he deposited the original copy in the House of Commons library, and for the BBC and Sky and news agencies all around the world to pick it up. The BBC referred to it as a remarkable document. Sky, I think, said we just read this, and it's fascinating. One of them said, an observer said, I'm experienced in these things. I can tell you that a letter like this wouldn't have come from Syria without being approved absolutely at the very top. This really is serious. One of the experts that they brought in, I think it was the BBC, said, well, really, we don't understand this. There seems to be some important new factor in play here, some power we don't know about. Yes, an important factor, the presence of an Englishman from the British National Party helping these people to pitch their very sincere, genuine offer and bid for peace in a way that a handful of MEPs would get and understand, and thereby turn the tide of history. So, it's going to be the front page of the next Voice of Freedom, which would have been here but for a printing press breakdown. Not us, it's a contractor, but it'll be out on Monday, so you'll have that. It's going next May to be an absolute key plank of our European election campaign, and especially of my re-election campaign. And it's going to be a huge thing. We're going to make a lot of it. We've got a very big war chest with which to do it. And we're going to really hammer home the point that usually politicians, British politicians, start wars. In Nick Griffin and the British National Party, you've got politicians who stopped a war. I just want to say in closing that it's something of which I'm more proud of that than anything I've done in my political life. I may well be into my dying day. But I couldn't have done it without you. Literally every single one of you, virtually everyone's face I know, in fact, yeah, virtually every face I know where you're from. I know what you've done in terms of leafleting, being out campaigning, talking to people on the streets, helping in elections, raising funds, one way or another, making a difference, helping to build this party. If I hadn't been an MEP, they'd never even knew I existed. I couldn't have been there to make that change, and there was nobody else. If I hadn't phoned and said, like, I'm willing to come, shall I come? Nobody else would have done. No one would have done it. The vote would have gone the other way. We would now be in this hideous war. It's as simple as that. I was only able to do that because of you, and because of the people that you, as officials, mobilise in your own areas. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving me that opportunity, for doing something which really was extraordinary, so that we can from now on, from this day forth, talk about and be recognised, the British National Party. Yes, we're the voice that talks about immigration and the hardships it's forced on our people and the ills that it causes. We're the ones who talked about it when it wasn't fashionable. We're the ones who made it possible for all the others to follow along. We're the ones who broke the ice on immigration. Yes, we're the ones who talked about grooming in the northwest of England, in Yorkshire, who ran the risk of being put in prison, who stood in a dock twice over facing 7 years for talking about it. Yes, we're the ones who forced the British establishment to sit up and take notice and begin to do something to protect our young girls and young Sikh girls and young black girls from the menace of grooming from a section of this Wahhabi crazy community that we have living in this country at the moment. Yes, we're the people who did that. But above that, on top of that, totally different to what anybody expected The British National Party, from this day forward, is the Peace Party. Thank you. Thank you.